Today is Thursday, 22nd August, and again, before I proceed, let me just once more apologise for the delay in the publication of yesterday's video. As I said, it's due to factors completely outside our control related to connectivity issues. Connectivity sometimes comes and it sometimes goes, but we are assured that it will be all sorted by Friday. In other words, by tomorrow. So I've decided that I'm going to just press on, continue to do programs as normal, and hopefully by tomorrow this problem will have gone. So today, 22nd August, we continue still with the conflict in Ukraine. A conflict which, of course, has now extended itself into Kursk region, where the Ukrainians are conducting their own attempted offensive. And at the same time, what we are learning is that in some ways, even as Western governments gradually now come to understand that they're running out of means to keep Ukraine supplied, they continue to dig themselves into an ever deeper economic hole, continuing the economic war against Russia, which is not bearing any kind of fruit. And as we will see, they're making their economic situation worse, even as the general economic situation altogether is deteriorating. But we'll come to that later in the programme. Let's start first, as we traditionally do, with the situation on the battlefronts. And the first thing to say is that we're getting very dramatic news now from two of the main battlefronts. One near Pokrovsk, the Pokrovsk area, and specifically, perhaps more specifically, the Selidovo area, and the other, interestingly, Chasiv Yar, though our old friend Andrei Marochko is back telling us that things are getting very dramatic in the Kupiansk area as well. Let's start, first of all, with the Pokrovsk situation. The first thing to say is that over the last few minutes, literally just before I started making this program, Redovka, Russian newspaper based in Smolensk, very nationalistic, very supportive of the war, but also very, very closely connected with the Russian military, with lots of reporters on the front lines. It's not, I should say, in my opinion, a totally 100% reliable source, but it is nonetheless a very informative one. Anyway, they have now produced film which they say shows Russian soldiers fighting in the outskirts of Novogrodivka. This is the small town or large village, depending how you want to describe it, just north of Selidovo and south of Pokrovsk, which the Russians are clearly aiming to capture. Now, I am going to assume that these pictures and this film are correct. I'll just read briefly what Redovka says. This is from Redovka, Russian newspaper again, and as I said, I've seen the film, and they say that Russian units have entered the Shanghai and Kishlak micro-districts of Novogrodivka. The Russian soldiers are knocking out the Ukrainian troops on the outskirts of Novogrodivka. It is reported that Russian military personnel have managed to cross the railway and enter the Shanghai and Kishlak micro-districts. According to local residents, the sounds of clashes can be heard in the areas of Vyazova and Michurin streets, presumably all located inside Novogrodivka. That, let me stress again, is what Redovka says, and we've got rather dramatic pictures showing lots of smoke and buildings and all of that, which appear to show clashes in Novogrodivka, though I must say the pictures themselves don't seem to me, at least as far as I can tell, to show any troops. And I'm absolutely not someone who is in the business of geolocation or anything like that. No doubt in a few hours' time, we will be getting rather more expert commentary about these pictures and films than I am in a position to provide. However, I am confident that this information is true. There were reports, which I think I discussed yesterday and maybe even the day before, that the Russians had indeed reached Novogrodovka, and that a storming operation of this small town or village was about to get underway. And Redovka itself was publishing yesterday and the day before claims that the line of coal mines and slag heaps that lie to the east of Novogrodovka and Selidovo were by no means any sort of impassable barrier, because there weren't enough Ukrainian troops to mount a defense line along these places, and the Ukrainians had not had time to prepare these places, to fortify them to any serious degree. And if these latest reports are correct, then these latest reports about fighting in Novogrodovka are correct, then we can see that those earlier claims by Redovka are true. Now, if the Russians capture Novogrodovka, or perhaps I should say, when the Russians capture Novogrodovka, which will presumably be at some point over the next few days, perhaps even by tomorrow, then it seems to me that the entire Ukrainian position in Selidovo, much bigger place, around 10,000 people, small town, which nonetheless plays an important role as a logistical hub, Selidovo will become undefendable. Whether the Ukrainians will choose to defend Selidovo at this point of the conflict is an open question. But anyway, we will see what the Ukrainians choose to do. And if Novogrodovka also falls, based on my own understanding of the maps, and as I've discussed many times, I'm not the best person to make sense of maps, but based on my own understanding of the maps, then it's very difficult to see how the Ukrainian positions in Grodivka, an even more important village to the north, lying on the main road to Pokrovsk itself, how Ukrainian positions in Grodivka can be defended. There's been a lot of discussion, by the way, about the battle in Grodivka. Many have been saying that the Russians have taken their time capturing this village, and it is true that over the weekend there were some expectations, which I reported, and to some extent shared, that the Russians would capture Grodivka fairly quickly, perhaps by the early part of this week. Well, that clearly hasn't happened, and the reason is that, understanding its importance, the Ukrainians appear to have committed what troops they had, apparently a mechanized brigade and some paratroopers, to trying to hold the Russians back in Grodivka. So an encounter battle has been taking place in that village, though some reports that I've seen suggest that the Russians now control around half of it, just saying. But anyway, the point is that very typically when the Russians encounter resistance in a village like Grodivka, in this area where they are very much on the offensive and where they have significant operational space, what they tend to do is that they tend to go round it. So they tend to capture villages to the north and south, start threatening Ukrainian supply lines, and the Ukrainians, finding themselves in a very difficult position, are then generally forced to pull back. And this has happened time and again. It happened fairly recently, for example, in a village called Ivanivka, which was located somewhere to the west of Grodivka, and which the Russians captured before they began the battle for Grodivka itself. So anyway, clearly events taking a rapid turn in the Selidovo-Pokrovsk area. And in the meantime, we've had some reports from the Russian Defense Ministry itself, which is also now providing us with information about Russian advances in the Pokrovsk area. They've just provided information that a village called Mezhovye, which is located to the southeast of Zelensky, has been captured. In fact, we have good reason to believe, in fact, we have no reason to doubt at all, that the Russians have captured significantly more villages in this area than the ones that they're reporting, alongside Mezhovye, which the Russians say, that the Russian Defense Ministry say, have confirmed that that they have captured today. We have information that the Russians in this area have captured Mykolaievka, Novozelanye, and Zavitny, and apparently, though I have not seen it, there is now film that shows Russian soldiers raising the Russian flag over the village of Ptyche, which lies to the southwest of Mezhovye, and also southwest of the village of Komishevka, which the Russians have presumably captured also. And if Ptyche has fallen, the next village on the way to the MO4 road from Karlovka to Pokrovsk is the village of Kalinove. There were reports previously that Russian reconnaissance units have already reached and maneuvered around this particular village, and it's likely that Kalinove soon will also fall, at which point the Russians will be in a position to attack the Ukrainians close to the MO4 road and to cut that road. And to say it straightforwardly, I think that with their major supply lines cut, the Ukrainian troops who've been trying to hold the Russians back in the village of Karlovka, which is still further to the southeast, will be forced to pull back, probably towards Selidovo or perhaps southwards. Who knows? And once the Russians have crossed the road, well, with Novogrodovka under their control, they will be in a position before long to launch an attack from multiple directions on Selidovo itself. And to be frank, I can't imagine in that kind of situation that Selidovo could be defended for very long. So the Ukrainian collapse in Pokrovsk continues at an accelerated pace. Now, I think it was yesterday or the day before, Radovka also reported that the Ukrainians have weakened further the defences around Pokrovsk by withdrawing the 47th Mechanized Brigade, elite unit, the most elite unit maybe, of the Ukrainian army, the one with the Abrams tanks and the Bradley infantry fighting vehicles, the one that was originally equipped with the Leopard 2 tanks and which tried and failed to break through towards Tokmak during Ukraine's 2023 summer offensive, and the one which was defending the Ukrainian positions in Stepovoye and Berdichi and around Ocheretino for many months over the last 6 or 7 months or so. Well, that brigade has been withdrawn from this area and has been redeployed north to Sumy region and to Kursk. In other words, inside Russia. And that was a report that we got yesterday, or the day before, from Radovka. And we've had now some visual confirmation of this, because in Kursk region, the Russians have been fighting Ukrainian troops, and they destroyed a tank. And Abdi Alaudinov, the Chechen commander, tells us that this was a US Abrams tank. And in fact, I understand, though I haven't seen them, there are pictures circulating of this knocked out Abrams tank in Kursk region. So far as I know, the 47th Mechanized Brigade is the only unit of the Ukrainian army equipped with Abrams tanks. And the fact that one was deployed and knocked out in Kursk region, to my mind, unequivocally confirms that the Radovka story was true and that they are now there. On the subject of the Abrams tanks, can I just say that I have completely lost count of the number of these tanks that the Russians have knocked out, and by the way, in nearly all cases, captured the wreckage of. But as I remember, the United States supplied Ukraine with 31 of these tanks, and I would have thought that by now the number of these tanks that are still usable by the Ukrainians must have been sharply reduced. Just saying. Anyway, that's the situation in the Pokrovsk area. The Ukrainians redeployed their best unit from this area to the Sumy and Kursk direction, and one of the effects of this is that their defences around Pokrovsk are collapsing fast and are continuing to collapse fast, with a failure to create a stable defence line, it appears, along the line of the coal mines and the slag heaps, two of which, by the way, are said to be under Russian control, and with the Russians apparently now storming Novogrodovka, having captured Ptyche, approaching the MO4 road, and threatening Selidovo, and ultimately, most likely, putting themselves in a position where the battle for Grodivka itself will end fairly quickly, opening the way for a final, conclusive assault on Pokrovsk and on the neighbouring town, or rather the large suburb of Mirnograd. And as we know, the Ukrainians are currently trying to evacuate the civilian population from Pokrovsk, though there's no word as to how that is going. And I'm going to say as well that I haven't actually so far seen any pictures of any mass evacuation taking place from Pokrovsk. I hope that that evacuation is indeed happening, because it's likely that the town will soon be a battlefield. Anyway, there we go. That is the situation in the Pokrovsk area. Now, over the last couple of hours, there's been less news that's come to me about the situation in Toretsk, where the Russians have secured control of New York, as the Russian Defense Ministry said a few days ago, where they're apparently advancing into Druzhba, another village to the northeast of Toretsk, and where the Russians are fighting inside Toretsk itself. But there's been no news, at least that has come to me, about the situation in Toretsk. No doubt lots of things are going on there, but I'm not sure. But interestingly, there has been quite a lot of news about the situation in Chasiv Yar. And I'm not going to go into the details of this. I've said many times that the fact that we're not getting information from a particular place for a certain stretch of time doesn't mean that a lot isn't happening there. It seems that a lot has indeed been happening in Chasiv Yar. Some weeks ago, about 2 weeks ago, I think it was, we received clear visual confirmation and admissions from the Ukrainian mapping projects that the Russians have now established a significant foothold west of the Seversky Donets aqueduct that bisects Chasiv Yar. And, well, today I read a report, very detailed report, that spoke of how the Russians have been steadily enlarging this bridgehead, and it gave a list of street names which the Russians have names of streets which the Russians have apparently reached or occupied. The report said that the depth of the Russian penetration varies from place to place, and from what I can understand, the spearhead unit that is leading the assault in Chasiv Yar continues to be the 98th Airborne Guards Division, which is, of course, a paratroop force. But anyway, the point is that the Russians are gradually clearing central Chasiv Yar. Now, it's probably still going to take some time because Ukraine appears to have some of its best troops in Chasiv Yar. We'll come to that soon. But my own sense is that by mid-September, perhaps, Chasiv Yar will have fallen completely under Russian control. And who knows, it's plausible that by then Pokrovsk and Mirnograd and even Toretsk might be under Russian control also. So that's the situation on the main battlefronts, the ones in Donbass, the area where the battle has been most intense and has been fought over the last 2.5 years. I said some days ago in one of my programs that it looked as if the Ukrainians were giving up on the fight for Donbass. They seem to have accepted that Donbass was conclusively lost. And I also said that about a day or so ago that the independent Ukrainian MP, Mariana Bezuglaya, had come out and said the same thing, that the situation in Donbass was critical, but the Ukrainian troops there were short of men and machines, that they were not getting artillery shells, that they were losing their positions one after another, that fortifications were not being defended anymore, that Pokrovsk was likely to fall soon, that Toretsk was in its final days, and she even floated the possibility of a Russian advance west along the main road from Pokrovsk all the way to Pavlograd, much bigger city, around 100,000 people, completely undefended. And she said if Pavlograd falls, then the Russians are on the Dnieper, opposite Dnipro itself. And I've discussed in many programs how, in my opinion, were that to happen, it would be existential for Ukraine. So that was Bezuglaya. And as we see, the trends on the Donbass battlefields continue to support that analysis. And we have now had some other very remarkable claims from Group of Forces North about the situation on the northern battlefields. Anyway, Group of Forces North has given us its own account of what has been happening on the battlefields in Kursk region and Kharkiv region as well, by the way, and we will come to that shortly. But they also posted a most remarkable message yesterday, one which, to my mind, in some respects, is even more remarkable than what they said about the whole situation on the battlefronts. And I'm going to read it. It says this: about the situation in the border zone. In the area of responsibility of Group of Forces North, the enemy, which is to say the Ukrainians, has concentrated almost all available combat-ready troops in its strategic and operational reserves. Most of its HIMARS installations, aviation and special operations forces. This is approximately 1/3 of all combat-ready battalions of the total number of the Ukrainian armed forces, together with foreign mercenaries. The enemy intends to attack in the Bryansk and Belgorod directions and is currently conducting reconnaissance in force. Our fighters repelled attacks by the enemy, numbering up to 200 troops in the Bryansk region, and similar provocations are planned in Belgorod region. In other words, a third, according to Group of Forces North, a third of combat-ready battalions of the Ukrainian armed forces are now concentrated in Kharkiv and Sumy regions in Ukraine, and to some extent engaging in operations in Kursk itself, inside Russia, in other words. That is remarkable, and it does beg a lot of questions. What exactly is it that the Ukrainians are trying to do? Now, some are speculating that the Ukrainians are preparing a major offensive, that they're intending to advance westwards to seize they still hope to seize the Kursk nuclear power plant, perhaps push even further westwards, try to threaten Kursk and Belgorod itself. In other words, that they're planning a major offensive in this area. Well, anything, I suppose, is possible, and maybe the Ukrainians are planning something like that. But for the record, I think it's unlikely, and I think the time for something like that has passed. I think that we are getting not only reports now, but further confirmation that Russian mechanized units are starting to appear alongside the Marines and the Special Forces in Kursk region, and that their presence is starting to make a difference. There was a reference, for example, in one of the reports that I've seen to the presence of the 200th, I think it was Mechanized Brigade, Murmansk Brigade. It actually comes from the Leningrad Military District, which is part of the Group of Forces North. It appears to be a very powerful unit, equipped with both tanks and BMP-3 infantry fighting vehicles, which are very powerful infantry fighting vehicles, the Russian equivalent of the Bradleys, only they carry a stronger punch. The Bradley has a 30mm cannon, whereas the BMP-3s have a low velocity but nonetheless very powerful 100mm gun, just saying. But anyway, that particular unit has now been appearing on the battlefronts, and there are reports that other units, other mechanized units, are now starting to converge on Kursk as well. Now, some of them are coming from the north, from the Leningrad military district, which, by the way, is the military district which has provided all of the various units that make up Group of Forces North. So this is not a diversion of troops on the Donbass battlefronts that we're seeing. It's just the commitment of the heavy mechanized units that I've been pointing out for some time have not so far been deployed by the Russians to any great extent in the battlefields in Donbass, or obviously in Kursk itself, or in Kharkiv region. We're also getting reports, however, that the Russians are transferring to Kursk region several units that have been drawn from the Kaliningrad military district, which is the westernmost military district of the Russian armed forces. It is very, very heavily garrisoned by contract troops and other troops. It is sandwiched between Lithuania and Poland and has at various times been seen as a potential target by the Western powers. And it could be, as I said, there are lots of troops there. Some people in the Russian media are worried about this. They're saying that the fact that the Kaliningrad military district is giving up some of its troops to fight in Kursk region exposes the Kaliningrad district itself to potential attack from Lithuania and Poland. I have to say that I think a military operation by these NATO powers against the Kaliningrad military district at this time would be an insanely reckless thing to do. There are nuclear weapons, just saying, based in the Kaliningrad military district. And in the event that Russian territory were to be invaded by NATO, I have no doubt at all that the Russians would be willing to activate them. I think NATO understands that very well. So I don't think for the moment there is any danger of an attack on the Kaliningrad military district. But the point is that we're starting to see rather more powerful units of the Russian armed forces, mechanized units with heavy tanks and armored vehicles, infantry fighting vehicles, starting to appear, probably in response to this Ukrainian build-up. And I would have thought that that would be more than enough, taken together with the presence of the Russian Air Force and the Russian air defences and the missile forces and all of that, to hold back any Ukrainian offensive. And more likely than not, this Russian build-up will continue as Russian troops who are currently on furlough start to return to their regiments. And I expect that at some point over the next few weeks, we will see the preponderance, the balance of forces, the numerical balance of forces start to shift, and to shift decisively in Russian favour. Now, it's also perhaps worth pointing out that when Group of Forces North talks about the fact that a third of all Ukrainian combat-ready battalions are now deployed in this region, we are probably talking about a force that totals around 30,000 men, which does not, it seems to me, constitute a significant threat to a country like Russia. Just saying. So it's a massive concentration of forces by the Ukrainians, but it's not, I think, such as would necessarily alarm the Russians. And as we will see, for the moment, the Russians have the situation pretty much under control. Now, why then are the Ukrainians doing this? Well, maybe they are planning, as I said, to conduct an offensive deeper into Russia. Zelensky himself is now said to be visiting the Sumy region, no doubt to speak to the troops there and the commanders. He likes to do this. I don't think his presence is ever particularly welcome. But why are the Ukrainians doing this? Well, I'm going to just mention one possibility that was floated to me in an email, which is intriguing, and by the way, which did correspond closely with a passing idea of mine, one which I've had, but which I've gradually discounted, which is that it might be very difficult for Zelensky and his officials to simply announce a withdrawal and a surrender of Donbass, and that what they might be doing is by redeploying some of their best forces from Donbass to Sumy and the Sumy region, is that they might actually be using the Kursk offensive as a cover to withdraw all of their forces from the four regions. In other words, to meet Putin's demand so that they can then achieve some kind of a ceasefire. It's an intriguing thought. And this person also made the further point that the hardline nationalist brigades, the Azov Brigade, the Aida Brigade, all of those are still there in Donbass, still trying to hold the front lines. And that if Zelensky wants to rid himself of these brigades, which have been a problem for him, well, abandoning them to their fate in Donbass as he redeploys his elite units to Sumy region might be the way to do it. I think this is too sophisticated in the end for the Ukrainians. I think that this makes in itself little sense, actually, if one looks at the way in which the Ukrainians conduct things. I think that if such a Machiavellian plan were really being enacted at this particular time, then by now word would have come out of it in Kiev, and there'd be cries of betrayal and treachery and all of that. And I think we would by now have a serious political crisis in Kiev underway. So I think this is unlikely myself. But nonetheless, I just throw it out there. Maybe it's something to file away in a drawer, if you like. And maybe if events start to develop in a way that might confirm it, it might come about that it needs to be pulled out and looked at again. But anyway, if that's not the reason, and if a further offensive in this direction is now unlikely, why are the Ukrainians doubling down in this way? And I'm going to suggest that there is prestige factors at play here. And the fact is, the Ukrainians launched their operation into Kursk region. They're finding the logistics exceptionally difficult. There are, by the way, starting to be admissions about this from the Ukrainians themselves, that keeping their forces in Kursk region supplied and reinforced is proving a nightmare, given how difficult the roads are and given the constant Russian bombing and drone attacks on their supply convoys. But at the same time, Zelensky and Syrskyi are not willing to pull back because of the massive prestige defeat that this would result in. And so if only in order to hold on to what they have, and perhaps conscious of the gradual Russian build-up in the border regions, they're now pulling all the available forces that they still have left to this area in order to try to keep the operation going itself. Well, that now brings me to the actual situation on the battlefronts. And I'm going to just read, first I'm going to start by reading what Group of Forces North have told us about what happened over the previous 24 hours. As we will see, on this occasion, the report from the Russian Defense Ministry corroborates Group of Forces North's account. It tallies with it almost exactly. And I will say quickly that I'm not going to touch on it, but there was a very vivid account of the battles that Group of Forces North are going to tell us about in a moment. There was a very vivid account of the same battles yesterday in Redovka, which again tallies with what Group of Forces North have said, whilst giving a lot of additional colour. But anyway, this is what Group of Forces North said. The past 24 hours were marked by the enemy's increased activity in the Bryansk direction. Bryansk is another border region of Russia, and there was an attempt by the Ukrainians to break through the border into Bryansk region. But just to anticipate, for the moment it has been unsuccessful. The Ukrainians have spent much of the last 3 weeks attacking other places around the border, trying to achieve the same kind of breakthrough that they achieved in Kursk region, but so far they were unsuccessful, and the attack on Bryansk region has just been the latest such attempt. Anyway, and Brugge Forces North says, and the destruction of a Ukrainian Sukhoi 27 that attempted to attack infrastructure facilities in the Kursk region. In both cases, the enemy got what he deserved, and this will continue in future. Now, we actually have film, apparently, of the Sukhoi 27 being shot down by a Russian Buk M3 surface-to-air missile. And I mentioned that earlier reports that had been provided by the Russians, by Group of Forces North, appeared to suggest that the Ukrainian Air Force had been attempting airstrikes in Kursk region, and that in fact some of the attacks on the bridges along the Sumy River had been carried out by missile strikes or bomb strikes by Ukrainian aircraft. And I said that I found this surprising. I suspect that Ukraine has again used some of its few remaining Sukhoi 27s, its best fighter jet for these kind of operations. We see that the Russian air defense system is now beginning to function in Kursk region. I'm going to make a guess that until recently, Russian air defense systems in Kursk city were concentrated around Kursk city itself and defending the nuclear power station. But now enough of these systems have arrived in the area to make the activity of the Ukrainian Air Force much, much more difficult. And I suspect that the Russians are now starting to deploy significantly more air cover to this area as well. Anyway, the Sukhoi 27 was shot down. There have been many claims that the bridges along the Sumy River were destroyed using HIMARS strikes. Group of Forces North suggested that they were airstrikes. If that is correct, given the difficulty Ukraine has operating HIMARS in this area, already 3 HIMARS launchers have been destroyed. It could very well be that with the Sukhoi 27 shot down, we're going to see fewer of these attacks on the bridges, and in particular on the pontoon bridges in the future. And just saying again, it will be noted that Group of Forces North says that the Sukhoi 27 was attempting to attack infrastructure facilities in Kursk region, which to my mind clearly means the bridges. And it looks like this latest attempted attack by the Ukrainians on the bridges was unsuccessful. The Russians can repair these bridges very fast. I have looked at film of the Sumy River. It is obviously a river, probably not very deep from what I can see. I am going to make a shrewd guess, as somebody who's done some walking in my time, that fit young men, such as you would expect the Russian army to consist of, would be able to wade through this particular river without too much difficulty. I suspect some armoured vehicles could probably do it as well. It would not be a difficult river at all to build pontoon bridges over. I think attempts by the Ukrainians to destroy these pontoon bridges would be a fool's errand, using up, again, precious missiles and aircraft in a game where they would ultimately lose. And if the Ukrainians have just lost a Sukhoi 27 in an attempt to destroy a pontoon bridge, then that is an extremely bad trade indeed. Just saying. Anyway, to move on with what Group of Forces North say. In the direction of Korenovo, the enemy significantly increased its efforts to capture the settlement of Komarovka. This is a settlement to the south of Korenovo, making 4 unsuccessful attempts to attack the settlement. During the repulse of these attacks, up to 40 Ukrainian soldiers, 2 armoured fighting vehicles and infantry fighting vehicles were destroyed. In other areas, we repelled attacks on the settlements of Malaya Loknia, Cherkaskoye Porechnoye, Ruskoye Porechnoye, and Ruskaya Konopelka. Note that these are the same villages we have been hearing about now for day after day. The Ukrainians continue to launch attacks on these villages. The Russians tell us that these attacks are being repelled. This seems to me to be further evidence that the Ukrainians here are at a standstill. And Group of Forces North says no positions were lost. Enemy losses amounted to 45 troops, 3 armoured fighting vehicles and 2 tanks, one of which, as I said, appears to have been an Abrams, though interestingly, they're not telling us as much. Anyway, then Group of Forces North, after giving us a long list of armoured vehicles that the Ukrainians have lost in these operations and telling us that the Ukrainians lost up to 330 men, dead and wounded, in Kursk and Sumy, then go on to say this. Due to the large losses of the Ukrainian armed forces in armoured vehicles, the enemy's deficit in armoured vehicles operating in the Kursk borderland is becoming noticeable. Often, Ukrainian Armed Forces Command throws naked infantry into attacks with the task of breaking through our defences at any cost. And this is, by the way, chiming with what we're seeing. The number of armoured vehicles that the Russians are destroying on any particular day is now falling. What is still being destroyed in significant quantities are tanks, and I get the sense that Ukraine has concentrated a disproportionate number of its tanks to this area, and that they are losing it rapidly. Anyway, the Group of Forces North also say that they're continuing to make progress in both Volchansk, and that they've made significant progress in the Lipsy area. These are, of course, both in Kharkiv region, and they give a detailed account of how an attempt by the Ukrainians to break through the border in Bryansk region was defeated. And as they like to do, they end their report with a quote, and this time it's from Helmut von Moltke, the commander of the Prussian armies in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870. In war, the most humane thing is to deal with the enemy as quickly as possible. I really do wonder who it is who is providing us with all this material from Group of Forces North. Anyway, the Russian Defense Ministry has its own account of what is going on in the area of the fighting, in the area of the fighting in Kursk region, and it is most interesting, and it is to that which I'm now going to turn. As I say, it tallies exactly with what Group of Forces North is saying, but it gives a little more detail, interestingly. It says that units of Group of Forces North and artillery fire repelled attacks launched by assault detachments towards Komarovka and Malaya Loknia, as well as thwarting the enemy's attacks in the directions of Korenovo, Martinovka, Olgovka, and Ruskoye Porechnoye. Note again, these are always the same places now. Note also that the Russian Defense Ministry speaks of Martinovka as being under Russian control. There have been some claims which have been circulating, including in the Western media, that the Ukrainians have gained control of Martinovka. The Russian Defense Ministry are contradicting these claims. I think there have been encounter battles. I suspect that the Ukrainians have sometimes managed to reach and enter Martinovka, but my sense is that they've always been pushed back. And then the Russian Defense Ministry says that they've defeated a sabotage and reconnaissance group in a forest belt southwest of a place called Skrilevka, which I cannot find on the map. It was from the 82nd Air Assault Brigade, and 2 armoured fighting vehicles and 7 Ukrainian troops were eliminated and 1 was taken prisoner. And then they provide details of where they have bombed the Ukrainian forces, and they've given, it's again essentially the same places, both inside Kursk region and in a Sumy region as well. And then they give us their own rundown of Ukrainian losses, that the Ukrainian losses have amounted to more than 300 Ukrainian troops. That's slightly less than what Group of Forces North say. They say 330 troops. The Defense Ministry says 300 troops, 23 units of hardware, including 3 tanks, 20 armoured fighting vehicles, 1 artillery gun, and 15 motor vehicles. And they are now putting Ukrainian losses since the start of the Kursk operation at 4,700 troops killed and wounded, 68 tanks, 27 infantry fighting vehicles, 336 armoured fighting vehicles. Now, these losses, particularly of armoured vehicles, are extraordinarily high. The losses of tanks are also extraordinarily high. Perhaps the Ukrainians have been able to retrieve some of these vehicles and send them back to the repair facilities in their rear. But I suspect that quite a lot of these tanks and infantry fighting vehicles and armoured vehicles have been lost either beyond repair or have fallen into the hands of the Russians. To give an example, the pictures that I saw of the Abrams appeared to me to be fairly close up, suggesting that the Russians have reached it and that they've captured the wreckage of it. Just saying. So, that might explain the point that Group of Forces North is making, that because of the sheer number of armoured vehicle losses, the Ukrainians are now obliged to send infantry to attack without the protection provided by armour. And I'm going to suggest that might also explain the decision to send more and more combat units to this general area. The Ukrainians cannot surrender this territory. To do so would invite a catastrophic prestige loss. So they are reinforcing what I would say is failure by piling in more and more units to make up for the loss of armoured vehicles. That's probably why the 47th Mechanised Brigade, with its Bradleys and its Abrams, are being sent to the area, and also to make up for manpower losses. So, in effect, the Ukrainians are committing more and more of their reserves to make up losses. And as we saw from the accounts by Group of Forces North and from the Defence Ministry, they're stuck. They're fighting repeatedly to try to capture the same places. It reminds me very much now of the fighting in Zaporozhye region in 2023, when the Ukrainians were making huge efforts to capture a few small villages, even as the main Russian defense lines, the Surovikin line in the case of the Zaporozhye offensive of last year, and the big defense lines that the Russians have built further north around Kursk and around the power station and in places like Lvov, remain far out of reach. And of course, the fact that mechanized units of the Russian armed forces are now also coming to this area and are starting to arrive in some quantity means that the Ukrainians have to run even faster in order to stand still. Now, there is a lot of guesswork and speculation about this assessment, and who knows, maybe I'm overstating things. Maybe things are not that bad. Maybe perhaps the Ukrainians do have some plans that I can't fathom. I would say that we've had days of discussion now that the Ukrainians were going to launch some major advance towards the village of Glushkovo and trying to capture a belt of territory south of the Sumy River. So far, no such attempt has been made. Maybe, probably, that attempt will be made at some point over the next few days. Of course, the Russians now have ample notice of it. They've probably built up more of their bridges, their pontoon bridges over the river. As I've said, it doesn't seem to me to be a significant obstacle for the Russians to reinforce their forces further south. It would be a significant obstacle if it became part of a defence line. I think that trying to wade a river like that in the face of resistance on the other bank would be extraordinarily difficult with any attacking soldiers or armoured vehicles being exposed. But that's not the case at the moment. I think that the Russians can probably resolve their supply difficulties in this area by building pontoon bridges without any difficulty. And if they have to retreat across the Sumy River, I cannot just repeat the point I've made before. I would have thought that it would be possible, even in the absence of these bridges, for most of the infantry to simply wade across, and it could be done without any very great trouble. Armoured vehicles, I accept, would be more complicated, but I suspect the pontoon bridges would by that time already be fully in place. Anyway, let's not waste more time about this. So, for the moment at least, the Ukrainians seem to be holding on, trying to hold on to what they have. Their various attacks towards Korenovo, towards Martinovka, northwards towards Lvov and other places, not proving successful. And by the way, just to say, our old friend Abdi Al-Aldinov has actually now come out and is saying the same thing. He says that the Russians have the situation completely under control. He said that, again, I'm taking this from Redovka. In fact, he said that that about 10 units of equipment used by the Ukrainian armed forces were knocked out over the past 24 hours in Kursk direction. And this again is roughly tallies with what Group of Forces North and the Defense Ministry says. He said that among the destroyed equipment was an American-made Abrams tank. And he went on to say that the Russian army controls the whole situation and the development of the military operations in Kursk, and that things are going very well. Well, that's his view. That's his account of the situation there. So, bear in mind, though, as I said, that he is actually there. He can see the situation for himself. So he can see what's happening. And I would, by the way, add that since we're talking about an ambush operations in heavily forested, hilly terrain with streams and rivers and all that sort of thing, it would be difficult to imagine more suitable conditions for the Chechen fighters that he commands. It's exactly the sort of ambush territory that they will be familiar with from the Northern Caucasus, where, of course, the Chechens fought the Russians 20 years ago, 10 and 15 years ago. So just saying. So anyway, there we are. That's what Al-Aldinov is telling us. Now, that then brings us back to the whole rationale of this entire operation. There are reports that Zelensky is continuing to try to press forward with some kind of negotiation process. He sent his defense minister, Rustem Umerov, to talk with NATO officials. Again, it's not clear about what, but what is the Ukrainian strategy at this time? Their defences in Donbass are crumbling. It seems that within Ukraine itself, criticism of the Kursk operation is mounting as the losses grow and as the territory in Donbass itself is being lost. And what exactly is Zelensky trying to achieve by all of this? Well, there was an interesting piece that's been written by somebody who claims to know a lot more about the situation politically in Kiev than I do. He says that one of the reasons that this operation was launched was that General Syrski was feeling under an awful lot of pressure from Zelensky himself, presumably. And by launching this operation in Kursk region, basically what Syrski did was save his job, preventing himself from being sacked by Zelensky. All that is very interesting, and it does suggest that there's bitter disputes, again, between Zelensky and some of his generals, with some of the generals apparently deeply sceptical about the Kursk operation. There's also, by the way, reports, which have apparently appeared in the Ukrainian media as well, that some Ukrainian units in the Donbass, specifically in the Pokrovsk direction, are now disobeying orders to participate in the fighting. Supposedly three battalions of the Ukrainian National Guard, which is not, properly speaking, part of the Ukrainian armed forces, but which is nonetheless, a significant force. So what exactly is it that Zelensky hopes to achieve? Well, I think with Zelensky, it's now become, as always with him, a matter of prestige. remain convinced that the original plan was to seize the nuclear power plant. The Russians are saying as much. Group of Forces is saying it. Abdialudinov is saying it. Dmitry Polyansky, the deputy ambassador to the UN of Russia, is also saying it. I've no doubt, and Putin himself has hinted at it. I've no doubt that that was the original plan. I think it is out of reach. I think that Zelensky finds it psychologically very difficult to be on the defensive and to see his army being ground down by the Russians. He's now come to understand the urgent necessity of negotiations. He cannot bring himself to negotiate from what he sees as a position of weakness. He's trying to turn the tables. He's been trying to turn the tables. He still hopes that if he persists with this Kursk operation, in some way, some miracle will come to his rescue. And he has always and continuously shown an inability to retreat from impossible situations. And that's the best explanation I think I can give. And it's the one which for the moment we'll have to do. Maybe there's more to this story than I understand, but I can't for the moment remotely work out what that is. Anyway, let's now turn to what the Western powers are doing, because this is becoming a very interesting story. It seems that over the last couple of weeks, the supply of Western military equipment to Ukraine has started to dwindle away. There's been this very complex story that the German finance ministry are blocking further military supplies to Ukraine. They're saying that the costs are now becoming too high, and that the report that the ability to go on paying for military supplies to Ukraine is now exhausted. And of course, Berlin, as is well known, reduced by half its financial commitments to Ukraine a few months ago. Ukraine is only going to receive around 4 billion euros in aid from Germany this year, instead of the 8 billion that it received last year. So military supplies for the moment are running down. President Pavel's attempts to source shells on the international arms market have, as I predicted, turned into a hideous embarrassment. There's been absolutely nothing said about this anymore, by the way. This plan, I suspect that it's been such a complete failure that nobody wants to talk about it anymore. A significant amount of money, from memory, I think it was around 1.5 billion euros, was committed to paying for these shells. They've delivered nothing. So they've delivered, maybe not nothing, but nothing like the amounts that 800,000 shells that was expected. So that's fading out. But nobody wants to seem to walk away from Ukraine, at least not publicly. It's just that they don't want to pay for it anymore. Apparently not the United States, where this is a hot topic. Not Britain either, by the way. There's still a lot of discussion about that Sunday Times article that appeared a couple of days ago. As I said, I think it's been over-interpreted. I think that usual British bragging about the heroic role that Britain is playing in supporting Ukraine and trying to persuade other Western countries to authorise the use of Storm Shadow missiles against Russian territory. I think that far too much is being made around that. The reality is that British military supplies and money are not being sent to Ukraine in the same quantity as before, because weapons supplies are exhausted, and Britain, as the British Finance Minister, the Chancellor Rachel Reeves has admitted, is also facing a budgetary crisis. So what are they doing? What are the Western powers doing? Well, it looks as if their plan now is to press forward with the $50 billion loan for Ukraine, which is going to be paid for from the interest accrued on the frozen Russian assets. It's clear, however, that there is still an awful lot of work to do in sorting out this loan. And the word that is now going out is that the European Union, or to be more precise, the European Commission, and some European governments are now thinking of changing the basis of the decision to freeze the Russian assets, and that instead of the freezing of the assets having to be renewed every 12 months, what they want to do is to freeze the assets indefinitely, with a review process taking place every 12 months. But henceforth, it won't be that the freeze has to be renewed. Instead, it will be that a decision to unfreeze the assets will have to be made unanimously, which means, given that we're talking about an EU that includes countries like Poland and the Baltic states, that the freeze of the assets will never happen. So why are they doing that? By this point, it ought to be clear that the Russians are not especially stressed about the freezing of their assets. From their point of view, this is illegal, but it's not impacted fundamentally on the situation of their economy. The Russian economy remains strong. It continues to grow. There have been reports recently that the Russian car industry is now back. Production is rising fast. It will soon be back to 2021 levels. The Russian car market has fully recovered. It's just one example of how the Russian economy has stabilized, and that the freezing of the assets has not had the effect on the Russian economy that many expected that it would, that certainly the West expected that it would. So clearly this isn't being done to punish the Russians. I am going to suggest that the reason it's being done is because there are, or at least proposed, this idea is being proposed, is not to punish the Russians. It is because there are worries that when the loan is floated, there won't be enough bondholders or buyers for the bonds able to make up the sums. And of course, what the West cannot risk is a situation where potential buyers stay away and the bond auction turns into a flop. And it might do, because at the moment, with all the various gyrations that have been going on in the financial markets, and with talk about the talk of Western central banks starting to cut interest rates, even as inflation remains sticky, and even as pressure on some Western currencies, including the dollar, appears to be growing. Well, it could be that bondholders are reluctant, and apparently, though I don't pretend to be very well informed about this, 2 recent auctions of US Treasury bonds only just managed to attract the necessary number of buyers. This loan for Ukraine is, of course, even more controversial than that. Now, there's been talk that the Europeans are going to provide guarantees, but the bondholders might be worried about the strength of these guarantees. What if the political situation in Europe changes, which it might do? We've seen elections in France which have increased the votes of the Rassemblement National and some of the left-wing parties that basically oppose these sanctions. We've seen the rise in Germany of the AfD and Sarah Wagenknecht's party. So maybe guarantees provided by Western governments and the EU might not be quite as cast iron as they appear. And of course, if there is a general settlement of the conflict in Ukraine, and that involves an agreement to unfreeze the Russian assets, well, the proceeds of these assets are supposed to provide the funding to repay the bondholders. And, well, how in that case are the bondholders going to be repaid? There is the further fact, pointed out by Jack Rasmus, by the way, and others, by the way, that the interest that is accrued from the frozen assets might not be enough anyway to cover the interest of the $50 billion bond, or at least to do so to any fully satisfactory degree. And besides, the Russians are threatening legal action. What if that legal action succeeds and the Russians manage to get court decisions in various places that the interest should be repaid to them and not to the bondholders? Well, all of this is very complicated and very difficult for the Europeans and the Americans, but the Europeans especially, who hold these guarantees. And I suspect that the reason that there's now a move to try to freeze the assets indefinitely is to reassure the bondholders, to tell them, look, whatever happens, we can guarantee to you that these assets are indefinitely frozen. You don't need to worry about the proceeds of the assets. It can't be unfrozen unless all of us, all 27 member states of the EU agree. That will never happen. So you are reliably guaranteed a steady financial flow. Well, one could see the logic of this. But think of what this is going to do in terms of the international reaction, the reaction outside the collective West, because countries like Saudi Arabia, the other Gulf states, countries like India, countries like the other big exporting countries, they're going to say to themselves, how can we risk putting our funds in Europe? Because if we put our funds in Europe, if we keep them in the various European financial centres, not only are the Europeans willing to freeze assets, as they've done with the Russians, but they are in effect going to freeze those assets indefinitely. One tiny step away from outright confiscation, which the Saudis previously said they would not accept, but we see that the Europeans instead are coming very close to doing precisely that. So, again, one wonders whether this has been thought through and whether this makes any kind of sense, but we could see again the urgency, the desperation to keep Ukraine going. Ukraine has now been, its finances have been downgraded to just imminent default level. It's unable to pay coupons on its loans despite the enormous financial assistance it's getting from the West. The Ukrainian currency has been under pressure. And of course, if Donbass is lost, and not a mention if the Russians reach the Dnieper, well, whatever funds are provided to Ukraine, the situation there is going to get very, very much worse. So, given all of that, the wise thing would be to pull back. But you can't pull back. Just as Zelensky can't pull back from Kursk, despite the fact that his army is being bled dry there, its armoured vehicles have been destroyed at an ever-accelerating rate, so the EU and the Western powers, but the EU especially, and the British, can't pull back from Project Ukraine. They double down on a freezing of the assets policy. That has already disastrously backfired on them. That has already provoked the BRIC states to move forward with their own plans to set up alternative global currency and trading systems. And you now find article after article in the Western media, in the financial press, pointing this out. But the momentum to keep Ukraine going, Project Ukraine going, to avoid any appearance of abandoning Ukraine, remains so strong that finding yourself deep inside this hole, the Western powers, the EU, continues digging. And the economic consequences for EU citizens are there for everyone to see. They're there for everyone to see in Britain and in the United States as well, by the way. I understand that Larry Summers, for example, has been saying that, who is, after all, a Harvard economist and former top US Treasury official, as I well remember. Anyway, he's now coming out and saying that, forget about the inflation figures that the US government is providing. The real inflation figures are very, very much higher than those. And he's providing his own sets of figures, which are startling, if I may say so, but which I'm not going to discuss today. Anyway, what about the EU? Well, a couple of weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, I started to see all sorts of articles appearing, planted articles, I'm sure, coming, I suspect, from the German government, saying that things were now starting to sort themselves out. Germany's competitive position had been restored, that industry was beginning to recover, that things were, the worst, the bottom had been reached, and things would soon be back to normal in Germany. Well, that was a few weeks ago. We've now had PMI figures from Germany. They show continuing collapses in the state of the German economy, that the German economy continues to decline, had apparently an awful mess. Just to read, Dr. Cyrus Della Rubia, chief economist at Hamburg Commercial Bank, offers a damning assessment of Germany's PMI figures. And now there's the quote: "These numbers are a real mess. The recession in Germany's manufacturing sector deepened in August with no recovery in sight. New orders took a sharper dive than last month, mainly due to a significant drop in foreign demand, signalling more trouble ahead. Given this, it's hardly surprising that companies are ramping up staff cuts and slashing inventories of inputs even more aggressively than before. The struggles in manufacturing are starting to spill over into the otherwise steady services sector. For the third month in a row, services activity growth has slowed. New business is barely growing, and backlogs declined once again. The export side of services, including tourism, isn't offering much support either, shrinking at an even faster rate than in July. The anticipated recovery in the second half of this year is failing to take shape. There were good reasons to be hopeful. Lower inflation, higher wages seem like a perfect recipe for increasing consumption. Plus, global industry had started to bounce back, something Germany typically benefits from. But it appears that uncertainty around economic policy, that's an interesting new excuse, has put a damper on consumer spending, whilst the global manufacturing upswing turned sour before German companies could feel the boost. Instead, the odds of a second straight quarter of negative growth have gone up, meaning we might be starting to talk about a recession in Germany soon. And then he continues, after such a prolonged slump that began in mid-2022, a significant date, some might think, but never mind, he doesn't say that. The renewed optimism among manufacturers seen earlier this year is fading fast. Manufacturers' expectations towards future output have now been below the long-term average for 2 consecutive months, mirroring the continuous decline in outstanding orders, which have been shrinking for an uninterrupted 27 months. The anticipated interest rate cuts by the European Central Bank, expected by most analysts, might lift spirits a little, but it's clear that the overall mood remains poor. Well, notice he doesn't say anything about Nord Stream, Ukraine, loss of gas, cheap gas from Russia, all of these things, loss of the Russian market, the fact that German car exports and investments to Russia have taken a hit. He doesn't mention any of this. He doesn't mention also the loss of confidence globally caused by the freezing of the Russian assets, which of course Germany was instrumental in bringing about. Until this denialism ends about the causes of Germany's economic malaise, it's going to be incredibly difficult to turn things around, if it's even possible. But there it is, faced with this engulfing disaster, the instinct of the Scholz government, of other EU governments, and of course of the European Commission, is to double down. Not so different from what Vladimir Zelensky is doing in Kursk. Well, this is where I finish my program today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop. Links under this video. And last but not least, if you like this program, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.